The wind was a cruel master on the plains, a relentless tyrant of ice and fury that clawed at Ilara's threadbare cloak, seeking to tear the very warmth from her bones. Each gust was a physical blow, a reminder of her banishment from a life that had once been respectable, even comfortable. Snow, as fine and sharp as ground glass, drove into her face, blurring the line between the dying gray light of the sky and the endless white desolation of the earth. She stumbled onward, her legs numb, her lungs burning with every ragged breath. She was no longer a schoolteacher, a woman of letters and quiet dignity. She was a creature reduced to the primal urge of survival, fleeing a man whose cruelty was as vast and cold as the landscape now threatening to consume her. Silas Blackwood, with his arrogant smile and possessive gaze, had cast her out, branding her with lies and leaving her for dead. But a flicker of defiance, a stubborn ember in the frozen landscape of her heart, refused to be extinguished. She would not die here. She would not give him the satisfaction. Yet, as her strength finally gave out and she collapsed into a snowdrift, the world narrowing to a pinprick of fading light, that ember began to dim. Have you ever felt a cold so deep it freezes not just your body, but your very soul? Have you ever been pushed to the edge of the world, with nothing but the tattered remnants of your honor to keep you from falling into the abyss? This is the story of such a woman, and of the man who found her at the precipice. It is a story of how two broken souls, lost in the unforgiving wilderness of the West, could find in each other a sanctuary, a fortress against the coming storm. It asks a simple question. In a world determined to break you, where does one find the strength not merely to survive, but to live again? He found her just as the last vestiges of twilight surrendered to the oppressive dark of a moonless night. Malachi stood on the porch of his isolated cabin, the one-room fortress he had built with his own hands, a place designed to keep the world out. He was a man carved from the same hard granite as the mountains at his back, his face a roadmap of past griefs and forgotten wars. He had come to this desolate place to be alone, to let the silence and the snow bury the ghosts of a wife and child taken from him by a world he no longer trusted. The wind howled a familiar, mournful song, but tonight, it carried a different note, a faint, desperate cry that was almost human. He dismissed it at first. The wilderness played tricks on a man's mind, especially a mind that welcomed solitude. But then he saw it, a small, dark shape against the snow, a disruption in the perfect, deadly white. Every instinct, honed by years of survival, told him to ignore it, to bolt the door and feed the fire, to let the wilderness claim what was its own. Solitude was safety, entanglement was a weakness he could not afford. Yet, a deeper, older instinct, a sense of honor he thought long dead, stirred within him. With a curse that was lost to the wind, he pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed a lantern, and stepped out into the blizzard, his boots sinking into the deep powder. He reached the figure and knelt, brushing away the snow. It was a woman, her face pale as marble, her lips tinged with blue. She was barely breathing. In that moment, Malachi's carefully constructed world of isolation was breached. He saw in her face not a stranger, but a reflection of his own desolation. To leave her here would be to abandon a part of himself to the cold. He gathered her into his arms, surprised by how little she weighed, and carried her back toward the flickering light of his cabin, the single point of warmth in a world of ice. The inciting incident was not a clash of swords or a thunderous declaration, but a quiet, reluctant act of mercy that would irrevocably alter the course of two solitary lives. Ilara awoke to the unfamiliar sensation of warmth. For a moment, she thought she had passed into the next life, that this gentle heat was the first greeting of a merciful heaven. But then she felt the scratch of a wool blanket against her chin and smelled the faint, masculine scent of wood smoke and pine. Her eyes fluttered open, struggling to focus. She was in a small, rough-hewn log cabin, lying on a cot near a stone fireplace where a low fire crackled and spat, casting dancing shadows across the log walls. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. She tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness forced her back down. A figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man with broad shoulders and a face that looked as if it had been weathered by 1,000 storms. His hair was dark, his jaw was set, and his eyes, the color of a winter sky, held no warmth, only a guarded watchfulness. He held a bowl in his hands, from which steam gently rose. He said nothing, simply extended the bowl to her. Elara shrank back, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was the West, a land where kindness was a currency rarely traded, especially to a woman alone and vulnerable. 3. Her mind, fevered and fragmented, conjured images of Silas Blackwood's cruel face, and for a terrifying second, she saw the same predatory glint in this stranger's eyes. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. The man did not answer immediately. He set the bowl on a small, crude table beside the cot. "Drink," he commanded, his voice as rough as bark. "It's broth." His tone was not unkind, but it was clipped, devoid of any emotion. It was the voice of a man unaccustomed to speaking. Elara stared at him, then at the broth. Hunger warred with fear. She was weak, disoriented, and completely at his mercy. But as she looked at him again, she saw something else in his stoic expression. Not cruelty, but a profound weariness, a deep-seated sorrow that resided in the lines around his eyes. He made no move to harm her, simply stood back, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting. Slowly, trembling, she reached for the bowl. The warm ceramic felt solid and real in her hands. She took a tentative sip. The broth was thin but savory, and the warmth spread through her, a fragile truce against the chill that had settled deep in her marrow. She drank it all, her gaze never leaving the silent man who watched her from the shadows of his solitary world. The days that followed bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of the sun beyond the cabin's single, small window. Time seemed to slow, measured in the crackle of the fire and the silent rituals of survival. For Malachi, as she learned he was called, remained a man of few words. He tended to her frostbite with a surprising gentleness, applying a salve of his own making without a word. He kept the fire roaring, the cabin a constant, steady bulwark against the unrelenting winter outside. 5. He would leave for hours at a time, disappearing into the white wilderness with his rifle, and would always return with fresh game, ensuring they never went hungry. He never asked her name, nor did he ask how she had come to be at death's door in the middle of a blizzard. His silence was a wall, but it was also a space where she could begin to heal without the pressure of explanation or the pain of recounting her story. Elara, in turn, began to reclaim herself through small acts of domesticity. 6. As her strength returned, she mended a tear in his coat with a needle and thread she found in a small wooden box. She took over the cooking, turning his simple supplies into savory stews that filled the small cabin with a comforting aroma it had likely not known in years. She swept the rough plank floor and kept the hearth clean. 7. These were the tasks of a life she thought she had lost forever, and in performing them, she felt a flicker of her old self return. They rarely spoke, but a language of action and gesture grew between them. He would leave a stack of freshly split firewood by the door. She would have a hot meal waiting for him when he returned from his traplines. She would organize his sparse collection of tins and sacks. He would leave a rare wildflower he'd found in a sheltered cleft of rock on the table for her. Trust was not given in words. It was built, log by log, like the cabin itself. It was a slow-thawing landscape, this relationship between them, a gradual retreat of the emotional winter that had held them both captive. The world outside the cabin was a place of danger and betrayal, but within its four walls, a fragile sanctuary was being forged in the quiet understanding of two wounded souls. Weeks turned into a month, and the relentless grip of winter began to loosen its hold on the high country. The fierce winds softened into a murmur, and the sun, for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, carried a hint of genuine warmth. Inside the cabin, a similar thawing was taking place. The silence between Elara and Malachi was no longer a void of caution but a comfortable quiet, filled with the weight of unspoken understanding. One evening, as Elara was washing their 2 tin plates by the firelight, she noticed Malachi carving a small piece of wood. His large, calloused hands, which she had only seen handle an axe or a rifle, moved with a surprising delicacy and precision. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't notice her watching. She could see the object taking shape, a small bird, its wings outstretched as if in mid-flight. The detail was exquisite, each feather intricately rendered. "It's beautiful," she said softly, breaking the evening stillness. Malachi started, his concentration broken, and he looked down at the carving in his hands as if seeing it for the first time. A shadow passed over his features, a familiar flicker of pain that he usually kept so well hidden. He hesitated, then spoke, his voice lower and rougher than usual. "I made them for my daughter," he said, not looking at her. She loved birds. It was the first time he had ever mentioned his past. The admission hung in the air between them, a fragile, precious thing. Ilara's heart ached for him, for the vastness of the loss contained in that simple sentence. She did not press for more, knowing the cost of such a confession. Instead, she offered a piece of her own brokenness. "I was a teacher," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I love books. The stories, they were a world away from this one." He looked up then, and their eyes met across the firelight. In that shared glance, the last of the walls between them seemed to dissolve. He saw not a burden he had rescued, but a woman of quiet strength and deep sorrow. She saw not a grim, silent recluse, but a man of honor and profound kindness, a man who had lost everything and yet had still found it within himself to save her. It was in this quiet exchange of vulnerabilities that affection, deep and true, took root, growing steadily in the warm, safe space they had created together, a sanctuary of the heart in the midst of a harsh and unforgiving wilderness. The changing season necessitated a trip to the nearest trading post, a small, dusty settlement a day's ride away. Malachi had put it off for as long as he could, reluctant to leave the sanctuary of his valley, and even more reluctant to leave Ilara alone. But their supplies of salt, flour, and coffee were running dangerously low. He set out at dawn, his last words to her a simple, gruff command: "Bolt the door. Don't open it for anyone." The words were terse, but his eyes held a deep and unfamiliar concern that warmed her more than the morning sun. While he was gone, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. Ilara found that she missed his steady, silent presence more than she could have imagined. The cabin felt empty, the silence no longer comfortable but hollow. His absence made her realize the depth of her feelings, the way his quiet honor had become the anchor of her world. Meanwhile, Malachi reached the trading post, a place teeming with rough men, trappers, miners, and drifters, and conducted his business with his usual efficiency. As he was loading his supplies onto his pack mule, his eyes fell upon a notice nailed to the post outside the general store. It was a wanted poster, but not for any outlaw he recognized. It was a cruelly rendered sketch of a woman, under which were the words, "Reward for the return of Ilara Vance, runaway indentured servant and thief." The name beneath the order was Silas Blackwood. A cold, hard rage, an emotion Malachi hadn't felt in years, coiled in his gut. The lies, the possessiveness, the sheer audacity of Blackwood branding this good and virtuous woman as his property, it was a violation that stoked the protective fire that had been kindling within him for months. He tore the poster from the post, crumpling it in his fist. He now understood the source of the terror he had seen in Ilara's eyes when he first found her. The external threat was no longer a vague shadow from her past. It had a name and a face, and it was actively searching for her. His purpose, which had been adrift for so long, became crystal clear. He was no longer just a man surviving in isolation. He was a protector. The ride back to the cabin was not one of quiet contemplation, but of urgent, focused resolve. The sanctuary he had built for himself had now become a fortress for two, and he would defend it, and her, with his life. The first sign of their arrival was the distant, rhythmic drumming of horse hooves, a sound that did not belong in the peaceful valley. Malachi, who had been chopping wood, froze, his hand tightening on the axe handle. His senses, always on high alert, screamed of imminent danger. He looked toward the cabin, where Ilara stood on the porch, her face pale with a dawning recognition and terror. "Go inside," he said, his voice low and steady, a calm command in the face of the approaching storm. "Bolt the door." She didn't hesitate, her trust in him absolute. The riders crested the small hill that marked the entrance to the meadow, 3 of them, led by a man on a fine black horse who dripped with an air of arrogant authority. It was Silas Blackwood. He reined in his horse a few yards from Malachi, his lip curling in a sneer as he took in the humble cabin and the solitary man standing before it. "I'm looking for something that belongs to me," Blackwood called out, his voice smooth and laced with menace. "A woman. I have a notice that says she's a thief." Malachi stood his ground, the axe held loosely at his side, his body a solid, unmovable wall between Blackwood and the cabin door. "There's no one here by that description," he replied, his voice flat and cold. "You're mistaken. This is private land. You should leave." Blackwood chuckled, a humorless, ugly sound. "Is that so? I'll be the judge of that." He dismounted, along with his 2 hired men, thugs whose faces were as cruel as their masters. "I'm not leaving without my property." The confrontation escalated, the air crackling with tension. Blackwood took a step forward, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. "I know she's in there. Send her out, old man, and I might let you live out your miserable days in this hovel." Malachi didn't move a muscle, save for the slight shift of his weight, a subtle preparation for violence. He thought of the woman behind the door, the quiet strength she had brought back into his life, the home she had made of his shelter. "She's not property," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "And she's not going with you." That was the final declaration. The moment the words left his lips, the fragile peace of the valley shattered, and the inevitable violence they had all been holding at bay was finally unleashed. The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire and splintering wood. Blackwood's men drew their pistols, but Malachi was faster, years of combat instinct taking over. In a single fluid motion, he hurled the axe, not at a man, but at the porch railing near one of the thugs, the impact sending a shower of sharp splinters into the man's face, making him scream and drop his weapon. Malachi used the brief distraction to dive for the cover of the woodpile, drawing the old revolver holstered at his back. He was a protector, a stoic guardian fighting for the sanctity of his home. He fired with deadly accuracy, his shots not meant to kill but to disable, to drive the threat away. He was outnumbered, but he had the advantage of knowing every rock and tree in his domain. The gunfight was a brutal dance of tactics and desperation. A bullet grazed Malachi's shoulder, a searing line of fire that he ignored, his focus entirely on protecting the woman in the cabin. Inside, Ilara was not cowering in fear. The woman who had collapsed in the snow, a helpless victim of fate, was gone. In her place was a resilient survivor whose quiet strength had been forged in the crucible of Malachi's sanctuary. Hearing the grunt of pain from Malachi, a wave of fierce, protective rage washed over her. She would not stand by while he fought for her. This was her fight too. She looked around the cabin, her mind racing. Her eyes landed on the heavy iron poker resting by the hearth. As one of Blackwood's men tried to flank Malachi and get to the cabin's blind side, she unbolted the door, poker in hand. The man, surprised to see her, lunged for her. Ilara swung the heavy iron rod with all her might, connecting with his kneecap. He howled in agony and collapsed. Just then, Blackwood, enraged, charged toward the cabin door. But Malachi was there. He tackled Blackwood, and the 2 men fell to the ground in a desperate, violent struggle. It was no longer a gunfight, but a primal battle of wills, Blackwood's possessive greed against Malachi's protective honor. Ilara, seeing Malachi struggling, grabbed the heavy, scalding coffee pot from the stove and threw its contents into Blackwood's face. He shrieked in pain, momentarily blinded, giving Malachi the chance he needed to subdue him. Together, bruised and bleeding, they had stood against the tyranny that had hunted her, and they had won. The aftermath of the fight was as quiet as the preceding moments had been chaotic. The 2 hired thugs, one nursing a shattered knee and the other a face full of splinters, were quick to surrender, their loyalty to Blackwood as thin as their courage. Malachi, his face grim, bound the 3 of them securely. He would take them to the nearest town with a marshal at first light and tell the whole story, presenting the false wanted poster as proof of Blackwood's malicious intent. With the threat neutralized, a profound sense of peace settled over the valley, deeper and more complete than ever before. Malachi and Ilara worked in tandem, their movements synchronized by a bond that no longer needed words. She cleaned and bandaged the gash on his shoulder, her touch gentle and sure. He, in turn, tended to a scrape on her arm she had gotten during the scuffle, his calloused fingers surprisingly tender. When they were done, they simply stood in the doorway of the cabin, the setting sun casting long shadows across the meadow. The air was clean, the world washed new. A year later, that same sun set on a vastly different scene. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was a home. A small, flourishing garden grew near the porch, filled with vegetables and herbs. For a sturdy new corral held 2 horses, and the sound of a cowbell echoed softly from the pasture. Laughter, a sound once alien to this place, was now a frequent guest. Malachi, the lines of grief on his face softened by contentment, was teaching Elara how to properly hold a rifle, his arms wrapped around her from behind in a gesture that was both instructive and deeply affectionate. They had built a life from the ashes of their pasts, a testament to the resilience of the human heart. They were a found family, 2 solitary souls who had discovered in each other a new reason to live, a shared future in the sanctuary they had defended and sanctified with their courage and their love. The threat had been vanquished, not just by force of arms, but by the unwavering strength of their bond, a force more powerful than any winter storm or human cruelty. We have journeyed with Elara from the brink of frozen death to the warmth of a loving home. We have watched Malachi, a man entombed by his own grief, break free from his self-imposed prison to protect and to love once more. Their story is a powerful reminder that even in the most desolate of landscapes, both of the world and of the soul, the seeds of hope can take root and blossom. It teaches us that true strength is not the absence of fear or pain, but the courage to face them, to stand for what is right, and to open our hearts even after they have been broken. Their sanctuary was not just a cabin made of logs and stone, it was the sacred space they built between them, a space founded on trust, honor, and a love that was as quiet and as steadfast as the mountains themselves. They found their happily ever after, not in the absence of hardship, but in the certainty that they would face all future hardships together. Have you ever found a light in an unexpected place? Have you ever witnessed the incredible power of love to heal the deepest of wounds? The world can be a cold and unforgiving place, but stories like this prove that the warmth of human connection is the greatest force for survival and redemption. If you believe in the power of second chances, in the strength of found families, and in the enduring triumph of love over hate, share this story with others who may need a reminder that no winter lasts forever, and that the spring is always worth fighting for. Let us know in the comments what part of their journey resonated with you the most, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of inspirational romance from the frontier.